Okay, all set to go. Now, we're going to spend a little bit of time this evening talking in a bit more detail about some of the things we started on last week. But I happen to be having a conversation with someone today about this idea of value. The background of this is people know Ross Greenwood. Ross Greenwood, the finance guy at Channel 9, has a radio show, and I sometimes do some interviews with Ross. I did an interview with him a couple of weeks ago on Qantas and Qantas's brand value, particularly after their dispute last October. And I was just talking to a colleague about it earlier today, and everyone remember the Qantas dispute? Everyone remember what happened? They grounded their entire fleet. And this is what happened. October the 30th, 2011, Qantas grounded their entire fleet, 128 odd planes. There was an ongoing series of industrial disputes. Basically, under Australian regulations, a union can give an employer a notice of dispute and say, we are going to take some action in 3 days' time. It might be we're going to go on strike in 3 days' time. The organisation then gets ready to deal with that dispute, and then the notice gets withdrawn. That's what the maintenance engineers and the baggage handlers are doing. So they were threatening to stop work, but they didn't. Of course, in the meantime, the union, the airline has to work on the basis they're going to stop work. And anyone who flew with Qantas in that period might remember that the pilots would wear a tie or a pin that asked you to support pilots, and they'd make an announcement over the PA system saying, we hope this doesn't inconvenience you, but we just want you to know why the pilots are in dispute with Qantas. So this went on for several months, and Qantas claimed that this sort of series of rolling issues with the union were costing them $15 million a week. And they decided that they would escalate the dispute by grounding all the planes and basically locking out the workers. Now, I'm not going to go into the sort of industrial relations side of it and the interaction with government and all those sorts of things. But it meant that about 15,000 passengers who were ready to fly, and rough rule of thumb, half of them were probably ready to fly home, half of them to leave home. So you got about 7,500 people who basically had no way of getting home unless they could change their travel arrangements. Once the fleet was grounded, the cost of the strike went up, or the cost of the industrial action went up to $20 million a day. So from $15 million a week to $20 million a day. Of course, the unions were outraged. They were outraged because Qantas hadn't given them any notice that this was the plan that they were going to take. Their members were locked out. The government Industrial Relations Commission, or equivalent body, was called in to resolve it. The tourism industry was outraged because you've got a whole lot of people who've made bookings for rental cars, hotels, whatever else, eat out in restaurants, who weren't going to turn up. The federal government was sort of outraged, and what I mean by sort of outraged is they spent a lot of time talking about whose fault it was, whether it was their fault, whether it was their dispute to get involved in or not. Like most governments, the Australian government has the power to get involved in an industrial dispute and decide whether they want to or not. And it was a bit awkward for the government because they didn't want to be seen to be taking sides against Australia's nationally branded airline, but also it's a Labor government, so intuitively there's some connection to the union movement. So all these people were outraged. They were outraged at what they saw to be, in terminology we use here, a loss of value. Loss of employment rights, loss of tourism income, loss of relationships. And the government, anyone who saw... the other thing that is worth noting is that the day prior to the fleet being grounded, Qantas shareholders had an annual general meeting at which they passed a series of, I think, $12 million worth of bonuses for the senior executives of Qantas. So if you just took those top-level groups, they all saw themselves as being disadvantaged by all this, particularly customers. What about Qantas shareholders? How do you think they reacted to this? Well, this is a tough question because they either liked it or they didn't. Who think they liked it? Who think they liked the CEO of the airline saying, I'm going to escalate this dispute, it's going to cost us $20 million a day? Or shareholders said, well, hang on, we've just paid you guys $12 million, shouldn't you be sorting this out? you're disenfranchising one of the most trusted workforces in Australia, which is Qantas pilots. You know, when they do that, professions that, you know, rated on trust, and nurses are always on top, pilots are always up near the top of that list. So who thinks that shareholders would have liked this? One person. Go to the front of the room. Shareholders loved it. Shareholders thought this was great. That's the Qantas share price. The down pointing arrow is the Qantas share price on the day the dispute was called. It spiked. And I'm not sure why there's a shadow on my... I only whipped this up because I had to go to the ASX and get a copy of the share price, so I only did this. That's why I was running a little bit late. And there's a long-term trend line that I've banged in there twice. I'm not sure why the shadow line's in there. But anyway, I thought it was not worth worrying about. So the long-term trend price in rising share price, in rising shares. Now the shareholders are the owners of Qantas. So the owners of Qantas were happy that the CEO was in dispute with everyone else, but had a $20 million a day dispute. Now, I don't expect anyone to have sort of any intimate knowledge of the circumstances that led to this rolling strike, but basically, Alan Joyce is quite interesting. And I'm not defending one side or the other in this, I'm just presenting this as an interesting case where people see the same, in terms of value, people see the same activity in two different ways. So the shareholders and Alan Joyce had said that these ongoing disputes were trashing the Qantas brand and trashing the Qantas long-term strategy. And the reason he argued that is that he said these ongoing disputes were basically escalating the cost of doing business and making us uncompetitive. And that's where the $15 million a week comes into it. So basically shareholders said, we're happy to take the short-term pain, we're happy to take the short-term loss in customer satisfaction, brand value, whatever it might be. But it's worth noting that Qantas had already lost, I think, on a year-on-year basis, their bookings were down 20% from October 2010 to October 2011. Their international bookings were down about 15%. Now, the bookings that were down for Qantas were their East Coast bookings, you know, Melbourne, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, which are their most profitable routes. So the cost of it wasn't just the number, you know, 15% of their business. It was actually their most valuable passengers were actually moving somewhere else anyway. So that's sort of all the background to it. But I just think it's interesting that different groups would interpret this entirely differently. If you're wondering what happened there, oil prices. Oil prices went through. There was a dispute in the Middle East, and oil prices went through the roof. And you see the share price recovered, went down again, and there's a sort of a long-term haul again. I'm not recommending to anyone buy Qantas shares. I'd never buy shares in the airline industry. But I just think it's an interesting example of how different people look at value from different perspectives. Now, I just want to finish off something that we spoke about last week. In fact, I spoke about it right at the start of last week, which was Peter Drucker. And I mentioned that Peter Drucker said that the purpose of the business is to create and keep the customer. It's been a long day. Do you want to throw something at you before sleep? I've got cold water. To create and keep the customer is the foundation of a business and keeps it in existence. Now this might sound a bit dramatic, you know, the customer alone creates employment, but it's sort of true. You know, it costs you money to have employees, there's only one source of income, and that's from customers. So he basically saw that any organisation had two functions, and only two. One was marketing, the other one was innovation. Now, I'll just emphasise again, in this context when I talk about marketing, I'm not talking about marketing as something that a department does. Well, you know, there's a marketing department, there's a sales department, a production department. I'm talking about marketing as something that an organisation does. And as we talk more about value creation, you'll understand that what I'm talking about is something that an organisation does, and that marketing in this context is something that an organisation does, and we'll talk about a couple of examples. And innovation. So finding either new things to do or new ways to do old things. They're really the only two categories of innovation. Of course, the other thing about marketing is marketing for most organisations is the interface with customers. So, once again, I don't mean a marketing department, but it's where the company meets the customer. That's sort of what marketing's about. So the idea of marketing has an important role to play, both in taking the offerings of the company to the market, but also in taking market knowledge back into the company. And we're going to have a case study later of an organisation that, one of the most famous brands in the world that almost went bankrupt. because